Okay, so Revelation 17 and 18 technically really don't tell us anything that's going to happen. Like they're not seals, trumpets, bowls, that sort of thing. They're kind of a celebration of what is going to happen. And so chapter 17 is relatively brief and a description of Babylon, and then in chapter 18 is a series of songs intermingled with a couple of narrative verses celebrating the fall of Babylon. So we need to take a few minutes and discuss what is Babylon in Revelation, particularly in Revelation 17 and 18, because that does affect to some extent the way we interpret it and understand it. There are essentially three possibilities for the identification of Babylon in Revelation 18. One of them is that it is actually the city of Babylon. Now, that would not be the modern current city of Babylon because it doesn't exist. So it would be the city of Babylon rebuilt. So that is one possible interpretation, the city that sits on the Euphrates River. A second possibility is that it is used to describe Rome. Babylon was a dominant city in its day. In New Testament times, Rome was the dominant city, and John, being in prison, isn't going to use the name Rome. Instead, he's going to use the term Babylon to describe it. This would be similar to us calling Las Vegas Sodom. It's the same sort of idea. Babylon was recognized as an evil empire, so to speak, and so Rome was kind of viewed as this evil empire. And so many believe that when he calls it Babylon, he's making reference to Rome. The third possibility is that the term Babylon just represents the world system. It represents everything that's opposed to God. And so it comes to represent that, again, much like Sodom. Real place or real history, but in some ways it represents like the most wicked thing that you could do. And we get this. If you want to call somebody wicked, you call them Hitler. I mean, that's just sort of what you do. If you want to call a place evil, you call it Sodom. That's just sort of the way. And I lean towards that view. There's a reference to the world system, but also at the end times there is going to be a rebuilding of the Roman Empire, it appears. And so it's maybe a reference to that as well, but I don't think it's the actual city on the Euphrates. So with that in mind, chapter 17 and 18 occur like during chapter 16 in a sense. So they're celebrating what's going on in chapters. So 16 is kind of the end of the tribulation period. 17, 18 are going to celebrate that. Then chapter 19 is going to be the return of Jesus. So to kind of pick up again. So this is kind of a let's stop and sing. This is not uncommon in the Bible. What is the greatest event in the Old Testament? What do they celebrate the most? The Red Sea, the Exodus, they celebrate Passover. It's the top deal. That's it. That's the greatest. And there are all kinds of references in the Old Testament to Passover and all of that. Everything he did. So the conclusion to the Exodus out of Egypt is the crossing of the Red Sea. That's the end of Egypt after them, so to speak. That happens in Exodus chapter 14. Without looking, does anybody know what happens in Exodus 15? Of Moses. Yes, it's called the Song of Moses. You want to know why it's called the Song of Moses? Because Moses sang it. Very good. Boy, nothing gets by y'all, does it? So what's interesting is Exodus 15 gives us no information. Exodus 15 is a celebration of the Passover. We get the information about the deliverance, particularly through the Red Sea in Exodus 14. Exodus 15 is a celebration of it. And we find the same thing. Remember Deborah and Barak? And they defeat, I get the Midianites in my head, but anyway. And then we have what's called the Song of Deborah. because Deborah sang it. Y'all are 2 for 2. Excellent, because Deborah sang it. And once again, there's really not new information. There's a little bit. She does call out a couple tribes for not showing up. But there's the event, then there's the song to celebrate it. So what we have is the end of the world's opposition to God, so to speak. And so now in 17 and 18, this is sort of a celebration of all that. 17 kind of describing the harlot Babylon. Now chapter 18's got a lot of singing, celebrating the end of that. And we'll talk in here a little bit about celebrating destruction. So after this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. Now, I don't know why this struck me, but I decided to just do a quick count because I have the software that lets me do this. There we go. All right, so the word angel, singular, occurs 55 times in the book of Revelation. It occurs 99 times in the New Testament, and it occurs 203 times in the Bible. Okay. So about 1 out of 4 occurrences of the word angel occur in the Bible, occur in Revelation, and over half of the New Testament occurrences are in the book of Revelation. Okay. Y'all don't need to take notes on this. Do like my students do. Just pull out your phone and take a picture once I've got them all up there. And then actually, this is what students do. They'll go, because I have copyrighted slides they can't take pictures of, but this is not copyrighted. This is the Paul Smith count, and you can go home and count them as easily as I can. By the way, this is on the ESV. I didn't try to do it in Greek and Hebrew, but now I'm going to have to since I thought of it. So the plural, angels, occurs 23 times in the book of Revelation, 81 times in the New Testament, and 91 times in the Bible. So for those of you who are not quick with math, here are the totals. So the word angel or angels occurs 78 times in the book of Revelation, 180 times in the New Testament, and 294 in the Old Testament. So about 1 out of every 4 occurrences in the entire Bible are found in the book of Revelation. And a little bit under half of the occurrences in the New Testament occur in Revelation. So we have a lot of angels in the book of Revelation. Quite a few, you can just see by the numbers. And so I don't know why this struck me. When I read after this, I saw another angel. I thought, another angel? Man, there are a lot of angels. And I thought, I was just wondering how many there were. It's interesting. I don't know what that means, really. Just that the word angel occurs a whole lot in the book of Revelation. Probably the idea is that much of what God does is mediated through angels. We saw the one that holds the waters of the earth and all those kind of things. And so God doesn't always do it directly. Oftentimes he does it through the angelic host. So after this, I saw another angel. I'll leave this up here for a minute if you're handwriting the notes. If you're taking a picture, you should have it already. But anyway, another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority. So do everybody know the difference between power and authority? Power is raw. Authority is power in the correct hands. Here's the way I think of it is, a gun is power, but a gun in a police officer's hands is authority. Like anybody can have power for good or for evil reasons or for neutral reasons, but authority is power in the correct hands. So this angel has authority, exousia. And the earth was made bright with his glory. Now, why is the earth made bright with his glory? Well, remember back in chapter 16, the 5th bowl, the sun was smitten and the earth went dark. And so it may be that the earth is still dark at this point, and then they're stunned by the light of this angel. And now we get, yes?
I have New King James.
Correct.
Then one of the 7 angels who had the 7 bowls, one of the bowls, came out and talked to me. Am I in the wrong chapter?
Yeah, you're in the wrong. We're in chapter 18. And you're in chapter 17. That we did 17 last week.
Where was that?
Either not here or sleeping, one or the other. It's like, man, that's not even close. And so, yeah, you're in the wrong chapter. So there you go. Mm-hmm. So he calls out with a mighty voice, and again, I would note that the book of Revelation pretty much has nobody speaking quietly. Everything's loud. They're always crying out with a loud voice or a mighty voice. And this is what he says, fallen, fallen. It's repeated to emphasize the significance, the greatness, and the finality. The idea is fallen, never to rise again. So this is what Babylon would say. Help, I've fallen and I can't get up. That is the idea. It's what's known as an aorist, meaning it's completed, it's finished. So fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. So this is not something that Babylon is because it's got great power and authority, and we're going to see how the greatness, what composes that. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. So the word haunt actually can mean a garrison, a guard, a keep, a wall, anything's kind of preserved or watched over. And so this is a place that's kind of watched over by demons, unclean spirits. That's the invisible part. And then the visible part are unclean birds and every unclean and detestable beast. Now, why do we have all this focus on unclean? Because, particularly in the book of Leviticus, how are the things of God described? Clean. So if you belong to God, you eat clean animals, and you have to go through ritual cleansing. And if someone has leprosy, they have to cleanse the tent with the hyssop, and they sprinkle the blood of the red heifer in there to purify it and to cleanse it, to be ceremonially clean. And so the focus on unclean then are all the things that are opposed to God. Demons, unclean spirits, birds, beasts. So this is, Babylon represents everything that is opposed to God. That's the description that we have here as the world system. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her. The word immorality is the Greek word porne, where we get pornography. And the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. Now it says the passion of her sexual immorality. The Old Testament consistently pictures God as the husband to Israel. And in the New Testament, we have the picture of Christ being the husband of the church. He's the groom and the church is the bride. So when you are married, if you are unfaithful to your spouse, that is sexual immorality or adultery. Sin, oftentimes in the Old Testament, is defined as adultery. So Hosea marries Gomer, then she leaves him, becomes a prostitute. He goes out and buys her for 30, he doesn't have 30 pieces of silver, so he buys her with 15 coins and pays the rest in barley. Buys her at the cost of a common slave, buys her back as his wife and sets her aside for a while. And then in chapter 4, 24 times Hosea uses the word whore or whoredom, the old King James. Some of the most modern translations use the word harlot or harlotry, because they have cheated on God. They've been unfaithful to God. So when there's description here of sexual immorality, may actually be sexual immorality. But it may also be a reference to their impurity towards God, that they are not faithful to God. They don't have anything to do with Him. So it could be one or the other. And actually, in some respects, it probably could be both of those. And then we get this statement at the end that's going to be expanded on in a minute. The merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. So I don't want to say anything about that because we're going to deal with that in detail here in a minute. So verse 4, then I heard another voice from heaven saying, doesn't tell us it's an angel, but we'll assume that it is, come out of her, my people. The word come out is like the word fallen. It's you do it and you don't go back. So once you come out, then you don't return. That's it. So it's like this. Y'all know the doors we have in the foyer? They get the crash bars. And if they're up, if you go out, the door closes behind you, can't get back in. So that's the idea. You go out, the door closes behind you, and you can't get back in. So come out of her, my people. And this is why I don't think it's actual city Babylon or even talking about Rome, but it's a reference to world system, like we're not supposed to be a part of that, and we'll see a little bit more about that. Lest you take part in her sins, lest you share in her plagues. The word take part actually means to fellowship. To fellowship in her sins. So I want to look at one more direct passages about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. So 2 Corinthians chapter 6, beginning verse 14. Apostle Paul says, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness, or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God, as God said. Now, verses 16, 17, and 18 are a conglomeration of quotes from all over the Old Testament. Several from Ezekiel, a couple from Psalms and Leviticus and Exodus. I will make my dwelling place among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore, go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing, then I will welcome you. And I will be a father to you, and you'll be sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. So there's this consistent call, not only in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, to not be in intimate, close fellowship with unbelievers. The reason being, righteousness tends not to wear off on people, but unrighteousness does have a tendency to wear off on people. I know y'all have heard this old preacher line before. You can't get health by hanging around healthy people, but you can get sick by hanging around sick people. So that's sort of the idea. And so he says, come out, separate from them, not to be in fellowship with this opposition to God. And now we're going to get this celebration, and we'll talk about right here how we need to understand this. For her sins are heaped high as heaven. Now, why in the world would this description be pulled out for Babylon? Well, Babylon is located on the Shinar plain, and after the flood, there was a command, go out and fill the earth. But what did they do instead? They built a tower whose height reached to heaven. So this is kind of a play on words here. Like, the original Babylon tried to build a tower to get to heaven. They didn't make it, but they did a good job of piling their sins up to heaven. So it's kind of a play on that. Her sins are heaped as high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Pay her back as she herself has paid back others. Repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double portion for her in the cup she mixed. As she glorified herself and lived in luxury, so give her a like measure of torment and mourning, since in her heart she says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, and mourning I shall never see. Now I want to start with the mourning and I shall never, the queen and widow thing, because it's actually a quote from Isaiah chapter 47. So in Isaiah chapter 47, verse 8, speaking to Babylon, Isaiah says, now therefore hear this, you lover of pleasures, who sit securely, who say in your heart, I am, and there is no one besides me. I shall not sit as a widow or know the loss of children. The idea behind this statement, I'm a queen and not a widow, and mourning I will never see, in the ancient world, and actually up until even into modern times, almost universally, women were dependent on their husband in some ways for survival. I don't know if y'all are aware of this. The Prohibition movement in the 1920s was driven by women. The reason was because their husbands were getting paid on Friday and drinking it up before they got home, and mom and kids are starving, and they're going to the churches trying to get food for their kids. So pastors, that's where the whole Prohibition movement came from. It actually was not theological. It was theologically based. You should take care of women and children. But that's kind of where it came from. So if a woman's husband died, unless she had children who could take care of her or she could get remarried, oftentimes survival was very difficult for them. So when it says, I sit as a queen, I am no widow, the queen would be taken care of. So Babylon had this idea of self-security. I don't have to depend on anybody else. I don't need to depend on God. I don't need to depend on anybody. I can completely take care of myself. I'm never going to know any mourning. So that was her attitude. So that part's pretty easy to grasp. But what about this calling, celebrating, rejoicing in the destruction of people? Well, Obadiah 15 helps us. I love Obadiah 15. You should underline this verse in your Bible and memorize it and just throw it out at your boss sometime. So I'm praying the Bible for you, Obadiah 15. So this is what he says. And this is prophecy against Edom because of their assistance in the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 by Babylonians. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head. So that's the Old Testament equivalent to do not be mocked. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows, that we will also reap. You sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind, that sort of thing. So they're praying that what they have done would be done back to them. That's the idea. And in full measure, that's the image of double for our deeds. So that part's pretty easy to grasp what they're saying. But what about us celebrating the destruction of a nation, the destruction of people, the destruction of a city? Well, Nahum will really help us. So if you can find Nahum, I'm proud of you. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. So Nahum is about 4 books in. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum. So it's the 7th book into the minor prophets. Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah are all contemporaries with Jeremiah, all preaching in the late 600s, early 500s BC. So we could read the whole book of Nahum, but we won't do that for the sake of time. So just look at the end of Nahum in chapter 3. And I'm just going to pick verse 14. It's a good place as any. The entire book of Nahum is a prediction of the destruction of Nineveh, the capital city of Assyria. Draw water for the siege, strengthen your forts, go into the clay, tread the mortar, take hold of the brick mold. In other words, fortify the city of Nineveh. There will the fire devour you. The sword will cut you off. It will devour you like the locust. Multiply yourselves like the locust. Multiply like the grasshopper. You increased your merchants more than the stars of the heaven. The locust spread its wings and flies away. So Assyria became the dominant power. There's how powerful Assyria was in the ancient Near East. When I used to teach Old Testament every week, they got a quiz every week. And the first question on every quiz for an entire semester was, what was the most powerful nation in the Old Testament? And the answer is Assyria. Sometimes I changed it, said what was the dominant nation in the Old Testament? But Assyria, there was no nation that even came close to rivaling them. Not even close. In terms of Assyria controlled everywhere from North Africa all the way over to Babylon. Way up into Turkey and Asia Minor. They were an empire unlike any other during Old Testament times, even more powerful than the Egyptian empire early in their history. So you see about how their merchants, they've multiplied and they've become wealthy by dominating all these other countries. So verse 17, your princes are like grasshoppers, your scribes like clouds of locusts because of the expanse of their kingdom. Settling on the fences in the day of cold. When the sun rises, they fly away. No one knows where they are. Your shepherds are asleep, meaning kings and generals and all that. Your shepherds are asleep, O king of Assyria. Your nobles slumber. Your people are scattered on the mountains with none to gather them. There is no easing your hurt. Your wound is grievous. In other words, the end of the city of Nineveh is already determined. All who hear the news about you clap their hands over you, for upon whom has not come your unceasing evil. Now that last verse is significant. We don't just rejoice in destruction. We rejoice in the end of evil. We rejoice in the elimination of evil. There's rejoicing when Mussolini is stopped. There's rejoicing when Saddam Hussein is stopped. There is rejoicing when Kim Jong-un, or whatever his name is, I just can't, I always think the fat field marshal. But anyway, that we rejoice when there is an end to evil. This is sometimes difficult for us because even though we see evil in our nation, we don't experience evil like much of the world does. You're not hiding your daughters inside of a hidden room that's 4 feet by 4 feet, because our nation is being overrun by an enemy who wants to rape and kill them. It's very difficult for us to comprehend. And I mean, look, our nation has plenty of problems, and there's plenty of evil. Just turn on the television. But not like so many nations have experienced. And when you are being oppressed by evil, you rejoice when that evil is put to an end. And the greatest rejoicing is when the greatest of evil is brought to an end. And so sometimes it's difficult for us because we don't live with that kind of oppression. Our family has some good friends, and she went on one of my parents' mission trips to Ukraine. And while they were there, they took a half a day and went to her hometown. And she just went to several of the mass burial sites because she has no idea at which one, or if any of those, her dad and her brothers are buried. They were arrested for being Christians and assumed they were executed at some point. It was a Sunday morning, and as a little girl, she was in church. I mean, Ellie tells the story that the KGB came into the church, nailed the pastor's tongue to the pulpit, and then beat him to death. So when I say we celebrate the end of evil, that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about people that are lying and stealing. And I mean, we're talking about just flat out evil and hatred for the things of God and just unbelievably abusive to fellow human beings. We want to see that ended. And so that's the kind of rejoicing we're talking about here, like what you find in Obadiah 15 or in the book of Nahum. Everybody will clap their hands over you because we have all experienced their unceasing evil. And that's sort of the idea here, that there is deliverance from that. So verse 9, the kings of the earth who committed sexual immorality and lived in luxury. So you see that in Isaiah, and you see it also in Nahum, which is talking about Assyria, about how wealthy they become. With her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, so here we are right at the end, and they realize that Babylon is not self-sufficient. Alas, alas, you great city, you mighty city Babylon, for in a single hour your judgment has come. And I'm going to come back to that here in a minute. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, pearls, fine linen, purple cloth, silk, scarlet cloth, all kinds of scented wood, all kinds of articles of ivory, all kinds of articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense. So we've had like valuable metals and jewels. We've had clothing. We've had wood and those kind of things like you build houses and countertops from. Then we're going to get verse 13 is going to give us spices. Cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, and then we're going to get foods, wine, oil, fine flour, wheat, cattle and sheep, and then signs of power and wealth, which are horses and chariots, and slaves. This is what's interesting, and slaves, that is human souls. Now, the other parts we get, this list, and over half of these are found in Ezekiel 27, where he does the same kind of thing. So they all just kind of represent this wealth and their sort of group. But it's fascinating that it says slaves, that is human souls. So I want to take just a minute to talk a little bit about slavery in the Bible, even though we could take weeks and talk about it. There are a variety of types of slavery in the Bible. As a matter of fact, the word translated servant and slave is the same. The difference is the context. Servant is voluntary, slave is involuntary. It's an easy way to remember it. And then within that, there are different types. Some slavery was for a short period of time to pay off a debt because you couldn't pay it off. That's the sort of thing. Some slavery was lifetime because you voluntarily committed yourself to a person. It's called a doulos New Testament. But then other slavery was involuntary. I find it fascinating when people will say, especially if they hate the Bible and hate God, one of the first things they'll throw up is, the Bible never condemns slavery. Two things. First of all, the Bible addresses where we live. The Bible doesn't say this is how it ought to be. This is how you live in a world that's not how it ought to be. As Christians, we live in a world that does not have the same values we do. So if you're in a world and you're a Christian who owns slaves, you set them free. That's what Paul tells Philemon. If you're a slave and you're a Christian and you're a slave, You're the best worker you can be because you're working for the Lord, not that person. That is not an approval of slavery. That's just, this is how you and I live in a fallen world. And by the way, we deal with this all the time. How do you as a Christian handle being in a business where you're asked to do things that you know are not legal? Like, we face this same kind of thing all the time. Living as Christians in a non-Christian world is sometimes very difficult, and kind of oftentimes puts us between a rock and a hard place. So that's the first thing. So the Bible just doesn't, for the most part, doesn't even address the issue of slavery like in a theoretical level. Just this is how it is, and this is how you should live in that kind of world on either side. But the second thing is there are some passages that do condemn slavery. The first one's the beginning of the Bible. God made man in his image. And I like the old Charlton Heston, the Ten Commandments. This isn't out of the Bible, but I like the line anyway. God made man and man made slaves. And that's what sin does. And by the way, this is why Jesus says not a whole lot like about divorce and stuff like that. He just always brings back, well, here's what you need to know about marriage. God made a man and woman and said, you're one flesh. And the same thing with the idea of human dignity. But then you have this verse right here. Slaves are not slaves. They're human beings. They're human souls. So it's fascinating. Not only have they gotten wealthy legitimately through some of this, well, when I say legitimate, I mean like just through, it's not a sin to sell gold. It's not a sin to buy gold. Or jewels, and we're thankful that y'all have bought and are wearing clothes. And we're glad that people use aftershave and perfume and deodorant and shower. So, there's nothing. But it is interesting. The only one of this long list of all this stuff that has any commentary is the slavery. And he saves it for last because this is the only one that is unethical. This is the only one that is just flat out itself sinful. And he doesn't just say slaves, that is wrong. He really drives it down even harder than that. That is human souls. Meaning, we can understand this not only in terms of slavery like we think of slavery, like practiced in Europe and the U.S. for several hundred years, but even slavery as it's practiced in modern times with human trafficking, where someone is promised a job and economic freedom and brought to the United States, which is the leading human trafficking country in the world, brought to the United States with the hope of all this, and then their passports taken, and they're put into, and they're basically sold into prostitution or working 20-hour days in a whatever it is that they're doing, and that is modern day slavery. And it is just as wrong as any other form of slavery because these are human beings created in the image of God. And so he says, they did the worst of things imaginable. Of all the things you can sell, nothing is sleazier than to sell another human being. That's as low as you can get. Maybe. It may be just as low to buy another human being. So I guess either side of the transaction would be equally sleazy and slimy and not approved by God. So technically there is one good form of slavery, and that is when we are slaves to Jesus Christ. But that's not what's being addressed here, obviously. So verse 14, so they've become very wealthy, and let's face it, it is easier to be self-sufficient in your mind when you have money than it is when you don't have money. That's just kind of the human nature. One of my professors said, we usually do pretty well in the difficult times because we turn to God. It's the times of abundance that we struggle with. And there's a lot of truth to that. So verse 14, the fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you. That's the fruit of all of this cargo, merchandising, that money. And all your delicacies and your splendors are lost to you, never to be found again. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. So we get this a second time. Alas, alas, for the great city that was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. In a single hour, all this wealth has been laid waste. And all shipmasters and seafaring men, sailors, and all whose trade is on the sea stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning, what city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, Alas, alas, for the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For in a single hour she has been laid waste. So this refrain repeats in chapter 18, the swiftness of the destruction of Babylon. So verse 8, we get a description. Her plagues will come in a single day. Then in verse 10, we get the first one of these in an hour. So in verse 10, in a single hour your judgments come. Verse 17, for in a single hour all this has been laid waste. And then at the end of verse 19, for in a single hour she has been laid waste. So clearly it's not mean just in one 60-minute time period, but the idea that it's very swift and very quick. Her destruction comes. And it's amazing sometimes how swiftly you can lose it all. Probably the greatest example of this will be the great stock market crash, where people woke up in the morning as millionaires, and by noon, some of them were jumping out of windows because they had lost it all, everything. How fast, it turned, how quickly you can lose it. And that's not just true of wealth, even though that's what's described here. Also can happen with your health, your mind. I mean, one major stroke, and look at how swiftly your life can be changed. And so it just seemed like they had it all, and then it was gone. So verse 20, we get this same idea that we found in Nahum. Rejoice over her, O heavens, and you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. So rejoice, even heaven is called to rejoice over the end of evil, over the destruction of Babylon that represents all that is opposed to God. And, there are some days where I really just pray this. Typically it's on days when my wife's had Fox News on. And it's just like, you're just ready for the end of evil, the end of people taking advantage of other people, the end of robocalls, the end of hearing about people who have lots of money and who spend lots of that money to get their children into the school they want to get them into, and how they lie and manipulate and all those kind of things. And, that's just on the headlines right now. And so we want to see that come to an end. People being sold and abused and all those things. We want to see that come to an end. We want to see people no longer strap bombs themselves and walk into somewhere, or try to hijack a plane and fly it in somewhere. I mean, we want to see an end to evil. And there will be a rejoicing when that is brought to an end. So verse 21, we have a mighty angel, there's another angel, took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea. So here we have, I'm sorry, these were the verses. There they are. It'll happen in an hour. I just like I put that clock on there. So here's a millstone. So the millstone actually is either one. The smaller one that goes around the top, and it can be pushed by people or oftentimes by animals. The most famous person to ever push one, of course, was Samson. But they're usually made out of granite. Very, very heavy, particularly the bottom millstone. So he takes up this stone like a great millstone and throws it into the sea to kind of be an example or a picture of what's going to happen. So will Babylon, the great city, be thrown down with violence and would be found no more. Now, in the Bible, the description of power that oftentimes is used is throwing a mountain into the sea. There are a number of references in the Old Testament, and of course Jesus said, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, be cast in the sea. So this is picking up on that same kind of imagery, the power that God has. Just like an angel can pick up this stone and toss it into the sea, so God can take up the city of Babylon and toss it away, so to speak. So verse 22, and now we get some of these instruments. And the sound of harpists and musicians, of flute players and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. There'll be no more celebration, no more parties. And then he's going to kind of just pile up here. A craftsman of any craft will be found in you no more. And the sound of the mill will be heard in you no more. There's no prosperity. There's nothing. And the light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the great ones of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. So notice how it's kind of bookended. So we have a party. We have all the musicians. But then the last description is the bridegroom and the bride, which in the Bible usually is the biggest party. Now, when we think about a wedding, we think you go on Saturday afternoon or Saturday evening to walk the aisle. We have the attendants, and the pastor goes through all that. Do you promise to only cook what he likes to eat? Give him a foot rub every night. All those kind of things. You make the vows. I have a set of vows I go over at the wedding rehearsal that are not the vows for the wedding, and it's always fun to watch Mom when I go over them, because the bride and groom know it's coming. And then we have the reception, and we wait for an hour and a half for them to take pictures. Starving, I might add. And then we eat, and they cut the cake, and they throw the garter belt and the bouquet and all that sort of thing. You have the first dance, the mom and son dance, and father-daughter dance, all that kind of stuff. And the whole wedding thing is 4 or 5 hours, and that's kind of the way, so not in Bible times. It was a week-long party. They really celebrated marriage. And they would go dancing down through the streets, and anybody in the streets would celebrate with them. Jerry and I were in Israel one time. We were in Jerusalem, and a wedding party came by, and everybody in the streets just started, and it was all start cheering them on. It's kind of like a community. It was pretty cool. And so he starts with party, and he ends with party. Times of celebration is bookended to show that this city that was wealthy and self-sufficient and thought it had no need of God and could just party and rejoice, no more. No more cause for celebration. No more cause for rejoicing. Because even these powerful merchants who had made all this money off of Babylon, there are no more. And all the nations were deceived by your sorcery. The word sorcery is an interesting word. It's actually the word pharmacy. So if you take any kind of medications, you're involved in sorcery. Now, here was the idea. It's actually connected to the word magic. And so in much of the ancient world, and even in many parts of the world today, practicing sorcery was also connected with taking like drugs, like being in a drug-induced state to help you get in touch with the spirits. Kind of thing. So many around the world still practice that sort of thing. And so this is about a magic that's connected with being in this sort of kind of transcendent state where you literally are out of your mind. And so they've been deceived by Babylon, who has deceived them. And the nations, even today, are deceived by the sorceries of this world, by the deception that wealth and strength and power are what secure you. But the Bible says, blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord. That's what really makes a nation strong. So verse 24, we're reminded again of why this judgment is coming on Babylon. And in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints. Probably the idea of Old and New Testament, but I want to talk a little bit about blood of prophets. And of all who have been slain on earth. Now, we're now really going to do a little Bible trivia. Who is the most wicked king of the southern kingdom in the Old Testament? The kingdom of Judah. There's one king who is far and away more wicked than any others. He reigned for 54 years. He was the son of Hezekiah. During his 54 years of reign, or 55, depending on how you want to date the ascension years. So out of his 55 years, we'll call him 55 because that's an easier number. Out of his 55 years of reign, there are 0 prophets. The Bible says that he slew much innocent blood. It is Manasseh. Manasseh is the most wicked king of the southern kingdom. Now, the northern kingdom had like a string of evil, wicked people. You have Omri and Jehu and Ahab, who's married to Jezebel, and it's like they don't have any good ones. But the southern kingdom has a few good ones, Josiah and Asa, Hezekiah. But this is the most wicked king, 55 years. During the reign of Manasseh, they closed the temple. Shut it down. Then he has a son, Ammon, who reigns for 2 years and is deposed, and his son Josiah becomes the king. And then Josiah, about 8 years into his reign, he's only 8 years old when he started, so he's about 16 or so. He opened up the temple and instituted a series of reforms and all that kind of stuff. But Manasseh was extremely wicked. Most scholars believe that when it says that Manasseh shed much innocent blood, that he was killing the prophets, executing anyone who spoke for God, anyone who stood up as a messenger for God. And so that's probably the idea behind this, that in her was found the blood of the prophets, that many of the prophets were executed by Manasseh. And he was the only one that was wicked. You'll remember that Ahab, when he was king, and there'd been a drought come because of Elijah, and Ahab sent Obadiah the prophet out to try to find water for the horses. The people can starve, but we need water for the animals. That just shows you their depravity. And Obadiah ran into Elijah and he said, I've hid the prophets by 50s in caves to protect them. And so Manasseh was the only one. He's probably the most famous because he went so long and was so evil and did them. So in her was found the blood of the prophets and the saints. People may be nice to Christians, but deep down, they hate us. They hate us. And y'all know the number one reason why Christianity is so hated and opposed? Well, there are two reasons. One is because it's true. People hate the truth. But the one truth is we are the only religion that drives a stake in the ground and is unyielding and unmoving on this. There is only one way to God. All religions are not the same. They're not different paths to God. There is but one, and it is through Jesus Christ. And if you do not know Jesus Christ, you do not know God. You cannot know him apart from Jesus Christ, because he is the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. And of all the truths that we proclaim, that is the one for which we are hated, because it makes us sound arrogant. Because we are claiming that we have the truth and all others are not the truth. And that is correct. We have the truth and all others are not the truth. And to the world that appears to be arrogant, but it's not arrogant, it is the truth. And there are lots of things that are the truth and other things are not the truth. We live in them all the time. This is why you tell children, don't touch the stove. The truth is it's hot. There's not an alternative. Okay. This is why we have a fence around our pool, because little kids can get in a pool and drown. There's no alternative interpretations here. This is the truth. If you can't swim, you fall in a pool, you can drown. And so it is the truth, but it is the one for which we are hated. And that's why so many prophets and saints were killed, because the call that our God is true. He has given us his word. He has given us his law. And it is not optional. It is not a way to heaven. It is the way to heaven. It is the only way to heaven. There is no other, as the Bible says, there is no other name under heaven given among men whereby we must be saved. And this is why Babylon is so opposed to us, because of that claim. And that's why she's found with the blood of the prophets and the saints. And that is why they want to get rid of us. But God will bring it to an end swiftly, as we're going to see next week in Revelation 19.